In the 1950s, vacuum tubes were the backbone of modern electronics. They were in everything, from televisions to tape players, refrigerators to radios, and every electronic device in between. That meant that there were a lot of tubes floating about in mid-century America, and like the light bulbs that they looked like, sometimes vacuum tubes would burn out and have to be replaced. But their ubiquity and their expense made the industry ripe for swindlers and fraudsters. Welcome to Electronic Age, a new podcast hosted by the Sarnoff Collection at the College of New Jersey. Here, we'll tell the stories from the history of 20th century electronics. I'm your host, Florencia Pieri, and I'm here to talk about one of the biggest individual cases of vacuum tube fraud in the 20th century. So join me as we discuss Joseph Lynch and the great vacuum tube rebranding racket. On March 15, 1956, a man called Joseph Bernard Lynch stood before a Boston court and pled guilty to fraud, ending a 20-year-long illegal vacuum tube scheme that began when Lynch was only 15 years old. In his youth, Lynch was probably just engaged in tube washing, a relatively common practice where someone, often an unscrupulous repair person, would take out an old, worn-out tube, wash it till it shone, and then sell the old tube as a new one. Here's Jonathan Allen, who as a kid in the 1950s repaired TVs and radios for extra spending money.
There were people who preyed upon both the repair service and the customers, if you will. They were known as the tube washers, and I think I may have mentioned these to you. What they would do would be they would on trash collection day, they would rummage through the trash cans of repair shops. Now, when you fix a TV or a radio, and you have to replace a tube, you take the new tube off the shelf, you take it out of the box, you plug it in, and you take the old tube and the empty box, and you throw them in the trash, right? Mm-hmm. So what the tube washer does is he rummages in the trash can, and he picks out the dead tubes, and he picks out the new shiny tube boxes, washes the tubes to get all the accumulated dust off them, and peddles them as new tubes until he's made a fair amount of dough, and then skips town, rides off into the sunset.
At the age of 25, Lynch left tube washing behind, and he settled on a new scheme, one that would prove to be much more profitable than simple tube washing. In the early 1950s, the General Electric Company noticed that someone seemed to be counterfeiting GE vacuum tubes. Though all the suspect tubes had the General Electric logo on the base, that logo was slightly off. The lettering was thinner than it ought to have been, and the placement wasn't quite right either. These tubes also had another thing in common. They had all been returned to the manufacturer under warranty as a defective tube. Although vacuum tubes were manufactured to rigorous specifications and all batches were tested before being sold, some vacuum tubes simply didn't work as well as they ought to. This wasn't a problem for the consumer, though. If someone bought a faulty tube, it was easy enough to check the date code stamped on it and see if it was still under warranty. If it was, then people could replace them at their local vacuum tube dealer and get a new tube. This was an ordinary enough practice in the 1940s and 50s that it was quite common for manufacturers to simply extend a 5% discount to wholesale tube buyers, with the understanding that about 5% of all tubes sold would be duds and have to be replaced. When a defective tube showed up, the seller would simply replace the tube with one in his stock, and that cost would be covered by that initial 5% discount. And this arrangement would save the manufacturer and the wholesaler the trouble of dealing with shipping and handling for the defective tube. The idea was that the tube sellers would be responsible for destroying the defective tubes, and if everything was being done in an honest and honorable way, that would be the end of the story. Joseph Lynch, however, was not an honest man. Instead of trying to convince a consumer that an old defective tube was really a new one with his old tube washing racket, he realized that he could use manufacturers' generous warranty policies to his advantage. While posing as a salesperson for legitimate electronic companies, Lynch obtained a list of code designations and examples of the trademark stamps and fonts for companies like General Electric, and he used those to create counterfeit stamps for date codes and brand labels. He would then buy large lots of old, burned-out vacuum tubes from his contracts in the repair business for as little as 2 cents apiece, and he would take these tubes to the makeshift laboratory he had set up in the basement of the building where he lived. At his lab, he removed the date code from the glass bulb and replaced it with numbers that matched the current stock in dealers' inventory, and rebrand the tube to make it seem as though it had been manufactured by a company with a generous warranty policy, a company like General Electric. With these rebranded tubes in hand, Lynch went to electronics shops all around the East Coast and exchanged the defective tubes for brand new ones on the grounds that the manufacturer's guarantee on them was still in effect. Lynch would then take these new tubes and sell them to other dealers and repair shops. Lynch began this scheme in 1946, but by 1955, dealers and manufacturers alike realized that something was amiss. General Electric was one of the first companies to implement a tube-for-tube replacement plan, where any tube returned to a dealer for warranty issues had to be sent back to the manufacturer before the dealer would see a credit for replacing the tube. And that was when General Electric realized that a lot of the tubes that had been coming into their plants as defective were not actually GE tubes at all. They had all been rebranded. That was when General Electric put Charles A. LaForge on the case. LaForge had joined General Electric in 1951 after a career as a detective inspector in the Bureau of Criminal Investigation of the New York State Police. LaForge's title at GE was head of security and plant protection, and while he had been hired for the express purpose of rooting out communist sympathizers among GE workers, the tube problem in 1955 was such a big issue for GE that they had LaForge investigate it. LaForge, who was working with detectives from the New York State Police, traced the trail of tubes back to Lynch's makeshift laboratory in Boston. After a 20-year run, the 35-year-old had finally been arrested. And when they searched his room, police found 10,000 defective tubes, as well as engraving dies and plates, all for this rebranding racket, though they didn't find much cash. "I'm a pretty high liver," he told a detective, but the high life had finally ended for Joe Lynch. He was found guilty on 2 counts of fraud. First, of, quote, knowingly using fraudulent labels and being in possession of counterfeiting equipment, and secondly, of selling these counterfeit tubes. He was sentenced to the maximum, 2 years in prison. His scheming wasn't over with that, though. While he was in prison, he spoke with Charles LaForge and showed the GE inspector how, if the company used a different kind of ink and stamping process, they could avoid falling victim to other tube rebranders. After that, Lynch appealed his sentence, arguing that his assistants should be rewarded with a shorter prison sentence. The judge, however, disagreed and ruled that Lynch had to serve out the entirety of his 2-year sentence. It's not clear what happened to Lynch after he was released from prison, or if he went back to his old ways. Regardless, though, vacuum tube remained a persistent problem. 2 years after the Lynch case, investigators in New York busted another tube rebranding operation that involved 10 individuals and 6 corporations and swindled more than $5 million from companies like General Electric and RCA. Vacuum tubes in the mid-century were big business, and big business invites big fraud. This podcast episode was created as part of the Sarnoff Collection's newest program, Down the Tubes, a microhistory of macroelectronics, which is supported in part by a COVID response grant from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. Check out our other Down the Tube offerings on our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages by searching for the hashtag DownTheTubes. And if you want to learn more about the history of 20th century technology, please visit us at davidsarnoff.tcnj.edu. Thanks for listening.